On a stormy evening, when most people sought shelter from the rain, Braden Foster found himself drawn to a simple act of kindness that would unravel into a nightmare. The streets of his suburban neighborhood were slick with rain, the sound of thunder echoing in the distance, when Braden noticed an elderly woman struggling against the elements. Clutching her thin coat around her shoulders, she seemed frail and vulnerable. Without hesitation, Braden approached her, offering his hand. "Let me help you," he said gently. The woman, who introduced herself as Mrs. Eleanor Whitlock, hesitated before accepting his assistance. Her hands were cold, trembling slightly as Braden guided her to the safety of her home, a weathered two-story house at the end of the street. The old house exuded a sense of history, with its peeling paint and ivy-covered walls, but it also had an eerie, forlorn air. Inside, Mrs. Whitlock thanked Braden profusely. The interior was dimly lit, filled with antique furniture and walls adorned with faded photographs. "Thank you, dear," she said, her voice quivering. Braden assured her it was no trouble and prepared to leave. As he stepped outside into the pouring rain, he couldn't shake the feeling of unease that lingered in the air. That night, Braden settled into his routine, the events of the day already fading into memory. But his tranquility was shattered by the sharp ring of the doorbell. His mother answered, revealing two police officers on their doorstep. Braden's name was mentioned, and he quickly joined the conversation, his heart pounding. "Braden Foster?" one officer asked sternly. Braden nodded, confused. "You're accused of theft and assault," the officer said. The words hit like a punch to the gut. "Mrs. Eleanor Whitlock claims you stole from her and harmed her." Braden's mind raced. "That's not true. I just helped her home," he protested. Despite his explanations, the officers insisted he accompany them to the station. His parents, bewildered and worried, could only watch as their son was led away. At the station, Braden recounted his story in detail, his voice trembling with frustration and disbelief. The detective, listening to his statement, appeared skeptical. "Mrs. Whitlock reported a missing heirloom and injuries consistent with a struggle," he said. Braden was stunned. He had done nothing wrong, yet the evidence seemed stacked against him. After hours of questioning, Braden was released, but the accusations weighed heavily on him. The next day at school, he confided in his best friend, Jenna. She listened intently, her brows furrowing with concern. "Something doesn't add up," Jenna said. "You should go back to her house and see if there's anything unusual." Reluctantly, Braden agreed. That afternoon, he approached Mrs. Whitlock's house again. The storm had passed, but the unease lingered. He knocked on the door, but there was no answer. Peering through a window, he saw furniture draped in sheets, as though the house had been unoccupied for years. A shiver ran down his spine. Braden and Jenna decided to dig deeper. They spent hours at the local library, combing through old newspapers and records. They discovered that the Whitlock family had been embroiled in a bitter inheritance feud decades earlier. A prominent member of the family had mysteriously disappeared, and rumors of betrayal and greed had plagued the Whitlocks ever since. Armed with this information, Braden and Jenna revisited the police station. They presented their findings to the detective, who seemed intrigued but unconvinced. "We need solid evidence," he said. Frustrated but determined, the pair continued their investigation. One evening, while sifting through online archives, Braden stumbled upon an article mentioning Mrs. Whitlock. It described her as a reclusive woman who had been estranged from her family. The article also hinted at a valuable collection of antiques she kept hidden in her home. Encouraged by the discovery, Braden decided to confront Mrs. Whitlock directly. He returned to her house, this time accompanied by Jenna. To their surprise, she answered the door, her expression wary. Braden carefully explained what they had uncovered, emphasizing that he only wanted to clear his name. Mrs. Whitlock listened, her demeanor softening as Braden spoke. Finally, she admitted that her accusations had been influenced by fear and mistrust. "I've lived alone for so long," she said, tears welling in her eyes. "When I couldn't find the heirloom, I panicked and blamed you." Her confession brought a sense of relief, but Braden couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. He pressed her for details about the missing heirloom and the family feud. Mrs. Whitlock hesitated before revealing a hidden compartment in her living room. Inside was a collection of letters and photographs that painted a picture of a family torn apart by greed and betrayal. As Braden and Jenna delved deeper, they uncovered a shocking revelation. The missing heirloom had been stolen years ago, and the blame had been placed on an innocent family member who had since vanished. The more they learned, the clearer it became that Mrs. Whitlock's accusations against Braden were a reflection of her own unresolved guilt and trauma. In the weeks that followed, Braden worked with Mrs. Whitlock to piece together the fragments of her family's history. Their unlikely partnership brought a sense of closure to both of them. For Braden, it was a chance to prove his innocence and grow from the experience. For Mrs. Whitlock, it was an opportunity to confront her past and seek redemption. By the time the mystery was resolved, Braden had learned valuable lessons about resilience, empathy, and the power of understanding. What had begun as a nightmare turned into a journey of self-discovery and healing, leaving Braden forever changed.